Much has been written about Ronald Reagan, our 40th president, his small town, Midwestern upbringing, his fame as a Hollywood movie star, the charisma that catapulted him to a career in politics. But a new account shows a man of profound contradictions and dispels some of the myths around the man. The book is Reagan, His Life and Legend by Max Boot. I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to Between the Covers. My guest is author and historian Max Boot. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, and a columnist for the Washington Post. His latest book, Reagan, His Life and Legend, has received the highest praise I can remember. Adjectives like superb, definitive, fascinating, essential, and it made the New York Times 10 Best Books list of 2024. Max, welcome. And I'm going to add another adjective, and that's balanced, because Ronald Reagan is this larger-than-life figure. I suspect that finding balance when you're writing this book was not easy. Would you talk about that?
You're right. I mean, Reagan could be a very polarizing figure. I mean, a lot of people loved Reagan. Some people hated Reagan. And when I began this book in 2013, there were a lot of books about Reagan, but there was really no definitive account, nothing that offered a balanced, objective perspective on the president. And so that's what I set out to do, to produce a book that was neither hagiography nor hit job, but rather a book that looked at both Reagan's strengths as well as his weaknesses, his successes as well as his failures. And I've been very gratified by the critical reaction, which suggests that I succeed in that ambition.
As you should be. I'm curious about the research. It had to be phenomenal with all of the archive materials that you went through. Any clue how many actual interviews you did?
I did roughly 100 interviews and spent a lot of time in the Reagan Library looking at a lot of documents, many of them once classified or unavailable. And in terms of research, I kind of feel like I hit a sweet spot with this project, because certainly, there's stuff being declassified all the time. The U.S. government is very slow about declassifying documents. And so, historians writing in the future will probably have access to even more declassified information than I had. But what they won't be able to get is the ability to talk to many of these people who worked so closely with Ronald Reagan. And I interviewed so many of them, and quite a few of them, frankly, are no longer around. Folks like Colin Powell or George Shultz or many others I interviewed at the beginning of this project a decade ago and are now sadly gone. And so I feel like I was able to kind of get that sweet spot at the intersection of oral history and archival history, and to make use of both resources to really present this first in-depth portrait of the 40th president.
My take is that this was such a fresh insight. Now, his presidency has been viewed through any number of lenses as unifier, this conservative icon, the great communicator. What your book shows are his strengths and his flaws, but I'd like to start with what you think he got right.
Well, in terms of his presidency, I think he got two big things right, which is why, if you look at polls of historians, he's generally rated as a top 10 president, somebody who's around 8, 9, 10 in the pantheon of U.S. leaders. And I think the two big things that he got right: his first term, he helped the nation to recover from the turmoil and the terrible times of the 1970s, the decade of stagflation, the Iran hostage crisis, Watergate, the Vietnam War. A lot of things went wrong in the 1970s. And when Reagan took over in 1981, there had been one failed president after another. And a lot of people thought that America's best days were behind it and that the country was virtually ungovernable. And I think his big achievement in his first term was that he restored America's confidence in itself, because he never wavered in his belief that America was a shining city on a hill. And because he had this boundless optimism about America and this ability to communicate that optimism, he helped to lift the nation's spirits. And once we recovered from this terrible recession from 1981 to 1983, he was able to run for re-election in 1984 on a slogan of "It's morning again in America," and people believe that. And then that set the stage for his second term. And the big achievement of his second term was helping to peacefully end the Cold War, working with Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, to ratchet down tensions, to reduce the level of nuclear armaments, and to end this conflict that could have easily resulted in World War III. And that's something that for which I think Reagan deserves tremendous credit. And people often look at his hardline first-term foreign policy of raising defense spending and funding anti-Soviet guerrilla movements and calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, and they focus on that. And what they ignore is that he actually shifted in the second term once he had a Soviet leader in Gorbachev that he could work with, and he was actually able to put aside a lot of this anti-communist dogma that he had been espousing for decades, and to work with the world's #1 communist for a better and more peaceful world. And I think that was the ultimate tribute to his pragmatism and his second major achievement.
There were a couple of other things on the other side that stood out to me, and one I get was his response to the AIDS epidemic, or actually really not much of a response at all. What do you think about that?
Well, that was definitely, I think, one of the biggest failings of the Reagan administration, and it's oddly enough something that he was not criticized much for at the time. Democrats in the 1980s were criticizing Reagan for running up budget deficits, which in hindsight don't look that bad because our budget deficits today are much higher than they were in the 1980s. And Democrats were not really calling Reagan out for ignoring the AIDS pandemic. But when you look at his presidency from the vantage point of history, that seems like a massive failure. The fact that tens of thousands of Americans were dying from this horrible new disease. And Reagan didn't even mention AIDS until 1987, until his presidency was almost over. He didn't fight for funding for AIDS research. He basically just ignored it. And I think that's a huge failing for which he is rightly criticized by historians, including my book.
For many, Reagan was this transformative president. He was an icon. I think your readers might be surprised about this white backlash in politics because his civil rights record, as you point out, was not stellar.
It really wasn't. I mean, I would say he was kind of a man of contradictions because on immigration, he was actually very pro-immigration, and he signed a bill that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. He often celebrated the contributions of immigrants to America. In fact, he said it was immigrants who made America great and were at the root of American success. But at the same time that he was celebrating immigrants, he was also, throughout his career, catering to white backlash politics. And people may not realize that in the 1960s, he opposed all the major civil rights legislation, whether it was the 1964 Civil Rights Act or the 1965 Voting Rights Act, or in California, the Rumford Fair Housing Act. And he often, kind of engaged in dog whistle politics, talking about welfare queens, talking about law and order. In 1980, he gave an infamous speech in Mississippi talking about states' rights and, trying to roll back civil rights laws. So, yeah, that's a record that, I think he should be criticized for. That's something he got wrong, even as he got some other things, I think, very much right.
That is why I look at your book as being so absolutely fair and showing all these sides. The farther away from history we get, I think the more perspective we can give it. For instance, when he was governor in California and there were these campus protests, I think 1969, the People's Park, deadly force was used. And did he benefit politically? And at the same time, how do you think he would fare with campus protests today?
Well, he did benefit politically from his tough response to campus protests, particularly at UC Berkeley. But looking at it objectively from the vantage point of history, I think it's fair to say that he overreacted, and he kind of gave campus radicals what they wanted, which was a confrontation with the establishment. I mean, nothing made radicals more mad than being ignored or, not being able to provoke a response. But Reagan was, kind of escalated and talked about he would be willing to undertake a bloodbath if necessary to restore order on campus. He sent the National Guard to put down the People's Park protests. You had, one person who was killed, another who was blinded. It was clearly an excessive use of force, and it stands out in contrast, I would add, to much of his governorship, which was actually very centrist and down the middle. I mean, he did a lot of things that displeased his conservative base and pleased a lot of Democrats. Like, he signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country. He expanded the amount of land protected from development in the state of California. He actually expanded funding for higher education. So in many ways, he was a very moderate and centrist governor. But this was, his hardline response to the campus protest was a deviation from that, but one for which he actually reaped considerable political reward, because, it was a political winner to be cracking down on these beatniks and hippies on college campuses who were seen as being this kind of privileged, snobbish elite. And most Californians at the time had not gone to college. And it was, whether it was, working class Democrats or working class Republicans, they appreciated his tough stance, even though I think in the end it actually backfired and created more confrontation than it ended.
We're familiar now with politicians asking, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Was Reagan the first to use this line?
I think he was. He used it in 1980 to devastating effect, and that was one of the ways that he beat Jimmy Carter. I mean, in 1980, there was still a lot of concern. I mean, many voters had concerns about, could we entrust the presidency to this one-time former actor? It seemed like, was he really up for the job? But, he spent much of the 1980 campaign convincing voters that, yes, he was going to be a credible president, and at the same time really hammering Jimmy Carter's record. And of course, the record was that we had, double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, unemployment was very high. So just on the economic record that Carter was running on, it was a very poor record. And Reagan was able to hammer that home, including with that memorable question that he asked in the one debate that he had with Carter, which was, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And very few Americans could answer yes to that question.
And that's what, with the economic policies of trickle-down economics, correct?
Well, that was Reagan's response to the economic turmoil, was to cut taxes. At the same time, he was expecting that he would eliminate the budget deficit. So it didn't really add up. And in fact, his tax cuts led to much higher budget deficits, which surprised him, but really didn't surprise any economists. I mean, this is why his own running mate, George H.W. Bush, had called his economic program voodoo economics, because it didn't add up. But I think what really was critical in the nation's recovery from this severe recession from 81 to 83, it was less Reagan and his tax cuts, and it was more Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Fed, raising interest rates to really wring inflation out of the economy. And so by 1983, inflation, which had been running, at double digits, had been defeated and was, at a very low level. And that allowed the nation's economic recovery. And Reagan was able to take credit for that and win this smashing re-election in 1984 when he won 49 states, which today in our divided country seems almost unbelievable, but it actually happened.
49 states does seem unbelievable. You mentioned a couple minutes ago that there is a rating system for presidents, and Reagan is right up there, I think maybe number 9. Why do you think he rates so high? What do you consider his finest attributes?
Well, as I said, I think in terms of what he actually accomplished in his 2 terms, I think, bringing America back from the dark time of the 1970s and helping to peacefully end the Cold War. But I think, a lot of the affection that he won from voters and eventually from pundits and historians, I think had to do with his kind of sunny, upbeat nature. He was somebody who was very good-natured. He was very difficult to dislike. Even if you disliked his policies, he was hard to dislike him personally because he was such a gentleman. He was always so courteous. He never engaged in invective or name-calling against his opponents, and he always, seemed to have the nation's best interest at heart. Whether you agreed with his policies or not, I think people would have to admit that he was motivated by devotion to the country, by patriotism, that he was willing to break with his own party when necessary. And I think all those things made him somebody who was able to bridge the partisan divide. And remember, in the 1980s, Democrats were still the majority party, but Reagan was able to win over a lot of Democrats. I think as his presidency has receded into history, he's in many ways looked even better. And that's, I think, part of the reason why historians rate him so high is because after he left office, the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union fell. And, people also looked back on the Reagan presidency with some nostalgia as a time of bipartisanship and the way that Reagan was able to work with Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, to get things done. And I think that stands in contrast to the partisan rancor which has characterized American politics in more recent years.
He was so likable. This comes across in your book. He was charismatic and charming, and he was an actor. I mean, today, in this age of social media and 24/7 TV, don't you think he would really be in his element?
I mean, I don't doubt it. I mean, he was a master communicator, although his medium of communications, it was, movies, it was radio, it was television. I don't know how he would do in the world of social media and, 26-word social media bites or whatever, but I'm sure he would adjust because he was truly a master at communicating. And one of the things that he was very good at was compressing his message. I mean, he didn't compress it into social media, but he certainly compressed it into sound bites. And, in the 1970s, when he was between the governorship and the presidency, he was giving regular radio addresses, many of which he wrote, and which were really masterpieces of concision, where he could boil down his message into very simple, stark language that was very understandable to people. And I think that's the secret to effective communication, whatever medium you employ.
Max, we used to have something in TV called the fairness doctrine, and that's when both sides, TV had to show both sides. Reagan rolled this back. Do you look at that? Do you draw a straight line from that decision to how media operates today?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of cause and effect, and I think that is one of the unfortunate legacies of the Reagan administration. It was the Reagan FCC in 1987 that threw out the fairness doctrine. Congress tried to revive it, but Reagan, at the behest of the radio broadcasters, vetoed that legislation. And that's what I think helped to lead to this very fragmented media landscape with MSNBC, Fox News, and others. And a lot of it, to be fair, has nothing to do with the fairness doctrine. A lot of it has to do with the internet and social media, things that didn't exist in the 1980s. But there's no question that repealing the fairness doctrine has, contributed to this partisan polarization we see in America. And, Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say that everybody is entitled to their own views, but people are not entitled to their own facts. Whereas today, people have their own facts, quote unquote. And so it's very hard to have a commonly agreed upon narrative. And I think that's part of the reason why we're so polarized and partisan divisions are so deep.
You do write about how well he worked across the aisle, how good he was at compromising. What do you think he would feel about where we are today, what the state of politics?
Well, it's hard for me to speak for a president who's been dead for all these years, but I'm sure he would be unhappy by the level of partisan posturing because he really believed that there was a difference between campaigning and governing. And he was able to move beyond a lot of his campaign rhetoric and do deals with Democrats in both Sacramento and Washington to pass big pieces of legislation to get things done. And, Reagan himself often said that he had, nothing but contempt for conservatives who want to go over the cliff with their flag flying. That was a term he often used. And what he often said was, I'd rather get 80% of what I want today and come back for more tomorrow than get nothing. And he was really somebody who believed in the art of the possible in politics, the art of compromise. And I think that's a lot of the reason why he was such a successful governor and president. He wasn't just playing to the base, he was actually trying to pass legislation and get things done.
You write about the assassination attempt that nearly ended this presidency, and I'm quoting from your book. You say, "This was Ronald Reagan's finest hour." And this really was grace under pressure, wasn't it?
It really was. I mean, it was an amazing moment. And remember, Reagan was somebody who had never seen combat before. He was in the Air Force in World War II, but he spent the entire war on a Hollywood backlot. So, he didn't have any chance to exhibit bravery under actual fire until he was shot at the very beginning of his presidency. And he almost died and came much closer to dying than most people realized at the time. And yet, when Nancy went to see him at the hospital, where he was literally at death's door, and he was joking with her, saying, honey, I forgot to duck. And then later, when he was going to be operated on, he was joking with the doctors, saying, I hope you're all Republicans. I mean, that was the quintessential Ronald Reagan. Even when he was literally dying, he was still trying to put people at ease and making jokes and try to make people feel better. And when, a few days later, when the public heard about how he had behaved after being shot, it provided a tremendous popularity boost for him, because this was really an example of real life heroism. I mean, he was really acting a lot like these Warner Brothers heroes of the 1930s when he had worked at Warner Brothers. But those Warner Brothers heroes, that was movies, that was made up, that wasn't real life. He was actually exhibiting that kind of grace under pressure in real life after having been shot. And so I think that really cemented his bond with the American people, this bond that was never really broken. People just admired him for the way he behaved in extreme adversity.
He was absolutely impressive in that moment, but you also write that four-star General Haig, not so much.
Well, this was, I mean, the Ronald Reagan shooting was ultimately wound up redounding to his political favor, but it was the downfall of Al Haig, who was the Secretary of State at the time. And Haig, after Reagan was shot, Haig rushed into the White House briefing room and told reporters, I'm in charge here, which was not true, because he was the Secretary of State, was not next in line to the presidency, and he just looked like this power-mad general who was trying to seize power in this moment of national crisis, and that was really the beginning of his downfall. And the following year, he would be fired by President Reagan, one of the few people he actually fired.
There's something about time, space, looking back at history. I'm wondering if you could have written this book decades ago, or would it have been a totally different book?
It would have been a totally different book. I mean, I think I've really benefited from having the advantage of hindsight, being able to look at Reagan through the lens of history in a way that was just not possible right after he left office. And that's why it normally takes many decades for good biographies to emerge of a president. And frankly, it's not just the sweep of history. It's also changes in my own life, because as I write in the book, I was somebody who grew up as a Reagan supporter. I was a young Republican. Reagan really helped to make me a Republican. And if I were still a Republican, I don't think I would be able to look at Reagan's life and record with the kind of objectivity that I think I've been able to achieve. And so I think it was helpful in that regard that I wound up leaving the Republican Party in 2016, becoming an independent. I think that gave me, kind of the distance and the neutrality to be able to really assess Reagan with his strengths and weaknesses in a way that I think would be very hard to do if you view yourself as a Reagan partisan.
What qualities do you think are essential for effective leadership? What did he show us?
Well, Reagan was once asked how an actor could be president, and his reply was, I don't see how anybody but an actor could be president. And that was kind of the root of his ability to communicate. That's obviously a huge component of the presidency, being able to use the world's biggest bully pulpit to get your message across. And he was a genius at that. What I write about in the book is that he was a great leader, but he was a poor manager, because while he was great at inspiring the nation and giving these wonderful speeches, he was not really involved in the nitty-gritty of governance, and he often didn't know what his aides were doing. That's why there were so many scandals during his presidency, Iran-Contra being the worst one of those. And he was often, very remote from the actual process of running the government or passing legislation. So more than most presidents, he was really dependent on having good aides. And when he had good aides, for example, in his first term, when he had Jim Baker as his White House chief of staff, he got a lot done because Jim Baker was one of the most effective chiefs of staff in U.S. history. But then his second term, he got into trouble right away because he allowed Jim Baker to switch jobs with Don Regan, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Regan turned out to be a terrible chief of staff. As Jim Baker said to me, Don's problem was he liked the chief part of the title, but he didn't understand that he was staff, and so he got a very swollen head and thought that he was the president, and he did not really advise the actual president very well. So, Reagan's governorship and presidency were kind of up and down depending on whether he had effective aides around him or not. But he was always an effective communicator, no matter what else was going on. He always knew how to inspire the nation.
The book is Reagan, His Life and Legend. The New York Times has listed it in its top 10 books of 2024. Max Boot, what an honor. Thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Truly a pleasure to be on. Thank you.
I'm Ann Bocock. Please join me on the next Between the Covers.